Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first of two discussion events for this semester. So this is Policy Potpourri, a discussion of domestic political issues, and this is a virtual panel discussion that is being hosted by the Department of History and Political Science and School of Arts and Letters, and we're co-sponsored by the MGA Political Science Student Organization, as well as the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science. Before we get into our panel and introduce our panelists, just wanted to very briefly introduce what programming we offer in political science here at Middle Georgia State. We currently offer a bachelor's degree in political science, as well as minors in political science, African and African diaspora studies, environmental policy studies, local government administration, global studies, and pre-law, as well as the certificate in European Union studies. So if you're interested in adding one of those to your major or even changing to another major, we have lots of opportunities there. And definitely talk to your advisor if that's something that sounds interesting to you. Particularly, the minors I think go well with a lot of the different majors we have in areas like business and education and nursing, and as well as the humanities and social sciences and natural sciences as well. So before we get started, we will go ahead and introduce our panelists today. We'll start off, I guess we'll do this in alphabetical order, starting off with Dr. Matthew Cowerly, who is an assistant professor of public safety and has actually been here at Middle Georgia State since 2016, was a lecturer in our political science department for quite a few years, and then maybe transitioned over to our colleagues over in the Department of Psychology and Criminal Justice earlier, I guess about a year ago, right now. So, and is a big part of the public safety program over there. And his doctorate is in political science from the University of Florida. And then we have Dr. John Hall, who is an associate professor of political science and has been here about the same amount of time, since 2015. And his doctorate is in public policy and administration from Auburn University. And to round out our SEC crew today, I am Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm the professor of political science here at Middle Georgia State, not the professor, a professor of political science here at Middle Georgia State. I've been here, although I guess in a few months I'll actually be the only full professor in political science here at Middle Georgia State, once our colleague Dr. Decker retires. And I've been here at Middle Georgia State for about 13 years now, since 2012. And my doctorate in political science is from the University of Mississippi. So we'll just very briefly, for those of you that have not joined us for one of these discussion events before, give you an overview of what we're going to do today. I have selected a few topics and discussed them with our panelists, and so they are probably prepared to give us some good answers to those questions. And we'll start with those, and then once we have moved our way through those questions, at least some of them, we will start accepting questions that have been submitted through the chat window. You can, at any point during the discussion, submit questions either as follow-ups or distinct questions in the chat. We're happy to answer, relay your questions and hear from our colleagues about those issues. The only caveats are, first, you are welcome to ask multiple questions, but to afford everybody an opportunity to ask the questions they want to ask, we do ask that you kind of, at least initially, keep it to one question per person. And then once we've kind of gone around the horn, if you will, and given everybody a chance to ask questions, you're certainly welcome to ask additional questions as well. But we do want to make sure that everybody in the audience has an opportunity to ask at least one question if they want to. Also, we do ask that you be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window. We may be discussing some potentially controversial topics, and just bear in mind that the standard expectations of members of the MJ community apply here in terms of civility and courtesy to others. So some of the potential questions that we will be talking about include the ongoing federal government shutdown, the No Kings protests that just took place this past weekend and what those might entail. The Supreme Court's cases this term. The Supreme Court, as is the case many years, is dealing with some weighty topics, and I expect that I have some interesting cases on the docket to talk about there. And then turning more to state and local government, we have a couple of elections coming up, or actually ongoing if you include early voting on the 2 seats on the Georgia Public Service Commission. So we'll talk a little bit about what that um, commission does and what might be at stake in that election, as well as some local elections, particularly doing with something called eSplost. If you've seen something about that, you might be curious what that is and why you should vote on it, or why you might have an opinion on that. Um, as well as some other local elections as well. I know that some municipalities, some cities are having elections as well. I know Warner Robins is having elections, Centerville is having elections. I don't believe Macon is, but a lot of communities in the state are. And so we may get into those a little bit, definitely be aware of those regardless. And again, that voting is ongoing, and we do encourage you to take advantage of your rights as a citizen and vote in those elections. And then also, of course, your questions as well. So, let's see. So I think I'll go ahead and stop sharing this screen so you can see more of our lovely faces. Except I can't. They've changed the interface here, so bear with me. Took me a minute to figure these things out. It's been a while since I hosted one of these in Teams. Apparently, they decided to change all the icons and stuff. So, I feel like some of our job candidates. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started with our first question. There has been ongoing federal government shutdown for the past 3 weeks. What is a government shutdown, number one? And what are the ongoing effects of this shutdown on the functioning of the national government and its employees? And I guess I'll let Dr. Hall start since he looks like he's volunteering.
Great question, Chris, and thank you for being with us tonight, Chris and Dr. Caverly. And I'd like to thank all our students who are joining us tonight for this first policy discussion of the fall semester. So we'll begin with a great question. What is a federal government shutdown? What does it do? Why is it important? We'll start things off for anyone who isn't overwhelmingly familiar with federal government shutdowns by recognizing one central point, and that is that they are not that rare. They happen. Since the early 1980s, I think this is about the 14th federal government shutdown. On average, federal government shutdowns average about 1 or 2 days. Obviously, this federal government shutdown is looking like it might break the record that was set during the first Trump administration of about 34 days. I think we're on day 22, and there's a very good chance we've got weeks to go. So addressing the fact that these things do happen, let's get a little bit further into the weeds in terms of what is a federal government shutdown. Now, for anyone who's had my or Dr. Caverly or Dr. Lawrence's American government classes, you know that when creating the federal government, Madison and Company, the framers of the Constitution, gave what we call the power of the purse to the legislative branch. Congress has the power, and the only branch that has the power, they have the sole power to appropriate all money spent by the federal government. And as we also probably know, it's the executive branch that spends most of that money. The vast majority of federal bureaucrats, the vast majority of the action takes place in the executive branch. So Congress has one excruciatingly important job. You could argue it is the single most important job they have, and that is passing a budget. You could say the same thing about the state legislature of Georgia. Its number one job is to pass a budget. The City Council of Macon, its number one job is to pass a budget. Now, there are times when the budget doesn't get passed, and that's actually more the norm now than it was in the past. When you're looking at that budget, it's important to note that the budget is like any other law. It's a law. It has to go through both chambers, the House and the Senate, and then it has to get signed into law by the president. Now, on occasion, you'll have the House and the Senate agree on a budget, but the president doesn't agree. That can lead to a shutdown if the budget hasn't been passed into law by October 1st, the beginning of the fiscal year. In this case, you have the legislative branch, which is failing to pass the budget. While the Republicans control the White House, the Senate, and the House, they don't have a 60-seat supermajority in the Senate. The Democrats do have, even though they are the minority party, they have enough power to basically stop the federal legislative branch from passing a budget. Now, when we talk about passing a budget, as I said earlier, that's the principal job of any legislature in the United States. And what Congress is doing now, in that they're failing to pass a budget, they're actually failing to pass what are functionally 12 appropriations bills. There are 12 appropriations bills in the House, 12 in the Senate, a total of 24. And what is happening now is they're failing to pass any of those 12 appropriations bills. If Congress cannot put together all 12 appropriations bills to keep the federal government fully funded by October 1st, which we passed again 22 days ago, then the federal government shuts down, and that's where we are now. Usually, the legislative branch or Congress will put together all 12 of those bills, or most of those appropriations bills, together in what we would call an omnibus bill. That's a large piece of legislation that could be passed, and then we would be able to fund the federal government. In this case, none of those appropriations bills have been funded, and we are fully shut down. Now, historically, if Congress is unable to pass an appropriations, all 12 appropriations bills, if they're not able to get legislation to the president's desk to fully fund the federal government, there's a way of getting around that. They use what we call continuing resolutions. Now, a continuing resolution is a great example of a political budgetary band-aid. Basically, a continuing resolution means we're going to continue funding the federal government at the previous level until we're able to get Congress to pass an actual budget. In this case, there is no opportunity, politically speaking, for a continuing resolution to allow the federal government to continue to go ahead being funded at previous levels. Congress is not able to fund the 12 appropriations bills. They do not have a budget. We are in a classic federal government shutdown for one reason. Congress is unable, the Democrats and Republicans in Congress are unable to come to agreement on a federal budget, so the federal government shut down. Now, that sounds like the federal government shut down. You would think that because it's called a federal government shutdown. But in truth, not all elements of the federal government are closed. Essential workers, essential agencies do continue to work. The only problem is that they're not going to get paid. They get to continue to work, or they have to continue to work, but they get paid once the federal government shutdown is over and we have a budget. The vast majority of federal government employees in non-essential areas are going to be furloughed, and they're going to be basically told not to come to work. They're not going to receive money until the federal government shutdown is over. That begs the question, what makes you an essential federal government employee versus a non-essential? And that's been defined over a century and a half by federal law. In general terms, you are an essential federal government employee, meaning you will continue to work during the shutdown if your operations protect life or property or the general functions of the federal government, meaning the presidency must continue, Congress must continue. While we can cancel and have canceled tours of the White House, the Oval Office is still going to continue to function. So while essential workers will continue to work without pay and all other workers will be furloughed, that's basically where we find ourselves. Again, this is not uncommon. It's not something to make anyone overwhelmingly worried, but we are getting into, and probably will get into, uncharted territory here with the length of this particular federal government shutdown. It's important to note that when you look at the federal government's budget, there are three main components that we cover in class. The first is what we call mandatory spending. That is outside the budgetary process. That involves programs like Social Security, Medicaid, that are funded through other legislation. The interest we pay on the debt, that's another part. It's the discretionary funding, which makes up a relatively small minority of overall spending compared to the others. That's what's being affected by the federal government shutdown. So Social Security still operates. Your Social Security checks will still go out to grandma and grandpa. The problem is the employees working at the Social Security Administration, if they are not deemed essential, they will not be working. So that can cause a huge problem with the flow of entitlement spending. Having given a very brief overall description of government shutdowns, and I noticed the clock here. I think I've been speaking for quite a while now, and I need to find a place to stop, but I'm having trouble doing so. It's important to know, why is this federal government shutdown happening? 100% of the time, federal government shutdowns occur when the federal budget cannot be passed either by Congress or the president won't sign it, because the Republican and Democratic parties disagree over policy issues. In this particular case, we have the Democratic Party that is insisting that the Trump administration's proposal to end federal tax credits for the Affordable Care Act, or the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, they don't want those federal tax credits to expire. If those federal tax credits expire, tens of millions of Americans will see, not might see, but will see their insurance premiums go up by over 100%. And that happens literally on November 1st. So the Democratic Party doesn't want those federal tax credits to expire, which would skyrocket insurance premiums for tens of millions of Americans. The Democrats also don't want the roughly $1 trillion tax cuts to Medicaid to become permanent. The Democrats are digging in their heels on these health care related issues that they vehemently disagree with the Trump administration on. Now, in terms of shutdowns, they tend to end when one party is clearly being blamed by the American people. When public opinion turns on whoever the American people think are responsible for the federal government shutdown, that's when federal government shutdowns tend to end. And usually it's not necessarily the president or the House or the Senate, whoever is seen as making a demand. That's usually who the American people blame for federal government shutdowns. And in this case, that's clearly the Democratic Party. However, in this case, the demands that the Democratic Party are digging in on are demands that the majority of Americans agree with. When polled, most Americans do not want the tax credits to end for the Affordable Care Act. Most Americans, when polled, do not want these draconian cuts to Medicaid. In other words, while the Democrats are nominally responsible for this shutdown, the reason their demands are being supported by the majority of Americans, especially when you look at independents. So that's why this has a formula for a shutdown that might last quite a long time. With that being said, there are some major dates coming up. The first being this Friday. This Friday is when the vast majority of federal government employees who have been furloughed or who are essential workers and are still working without pay, this Friday is the first Friday when most of them are going to get no pay. That is going to create a massive pushback. And then, of course, November 1st, which is next Saturday or Sunday, I haven't looked at the calendar, when you see those Trump tax credit, when you see the tax credits for the Affordable Care Act end, and you start to see insurance premiums dramatically increase. So having discussed what a federal government shutdown is and a couple of the variables involved here, if I were to make a prediction as to when this one would end, I would have no prediction, because generally speaking, the Democrats would get the blame for this and they would get a lot of pressure from the American people. But what they're digging in on, Americans generally support. So this particular federal shutdown, it appears to have legs, and it might last for several weeks. I think it could definitely rewrite the record book in terms of the longest federal government shutdown. Now, having said that, I've got about 15 other things to say, but I'm going to consciously not say them. So I'll stop talking there, and I will turn things over to Matt and Chris to fill in any of the blanks. Matt, you're muted. Chris, you're muted.
Uh, Thank you, John. Let's see here. I saw people put a couple of things up in the chat. Maybe I can address those. I don't know. Hang on here. Before I do that, the only thing that I would add is that some of the people in the audience might wonder, well, why did the Democrats dig their heels down on these healthcare related issues? Well, the reason why they did was because they didn't the last time. Back in the spring, into the spring and into the summer, we were where we're at right now, but they avoided a shutdown. They got a continuing resolution. And I'll just add something on the notion of a continuing resolution. A continuing resolution is an admission of defeat. You have no budget, so you've already lost the fight. Continuing resolution is just a way to kick the can down the road. But anyway, they got a continuing resolution, and at that time, the Democratic Party led by the Senate minority leader Chuck Schumer, signed off on a continuing resolution at that point, and the Democrats took a lot of heat. They took a lot of heat from their constituents, and they said that, well, you caved into Trump and you caved into the Republicans, and you're weak, and this is why you lost in 24, and all this kind of stuff. So the lesson that the political elites, the Democratic Party, learned was that their constituency want them to fight, and so this came up here. This was an opportunity for them to fight. The Congress does a great job at representing interests. They don't always do a great job at actually producing national public policy like budgets. But nonetheless, here, what we got here? From Douglas, he says, regarding the current tariff suits challenge the executive's ability to levy a tariff, a legislative function, what do you believe will happen to the president's usage of tariff funds to stopgap shutdown funding? Well, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question. And it actually begs a question about the separation of powers. How they're paying for certain non-essential people is they're moving money around. And whether it's from tariff money or some other things, they're moving money around. They did that, to pay the troops and a few other things. The president has some discretionary authority in terms of money that's already been allocated. But you see, there's a problem. And that problem dates back to the 70s. It's called the Budget Impoundment Control Act. See, the real difficulty is that John mentioned this, that Congress actually has the fundamental power of the purse. So they control the money effectively. They're responsible for it. They've delegated a lot out to the president. The Budget Act of 1921 did most of that. And so that's given presidents a certain amount of discretionary authority. But Douglas, you're bringing up a very good point here about how much authority was really delegated out. Can the president actually move money around that has been otherwise attributed to other things or acquired from other means and so on and so forth? So the simple answer to that is that, to be quite honest with you, I don't think we have an answer. I think that President Trump is doing what many presidents have before him. He's just said, "Look, I have the discretionary authority to do X, so I'm going to do it." And then if they get away with it, they tend to have that. But he may not get away with it. We'll see what happens there. There's another question here. Can't the House and Senate just pass legislation since they have both houses? They do not have to pass a continuing resolution. Well, I think what Jonathan is referring to here is that the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, and so I'll double down a little bit. John mentioned this, but you see, in the Senate in particular is what legislative scholars refer to as a minoritarian institution, and that means that they have a bunch of procedures in effect that allow them, for the minority, which in this case, from a partisan perspective, would be the Democrats, to have a greater say in legislative authority. And what they very often do, particularly in the Senate, is you have to be able to beat a filibuster. And basically, you got to be at the 60% threshold. And so the problem the problem the Republicans have in the Senate is they don't have 60 senators. And that means that the Democrats' ability to utilize various minoritarian procedures in the Senate rules, especially the filibuster, to slow things down or stop things and hold things in check, they can do so. They have other things, they talk about things like discharge positions and stuff like this, but all these things they have over in the House and whatnot, all those things are stuff the rules can be used to speed things up or they can slow things down. And right now, the Democrats are using the rules to slow things down. I sound like I'm beating up on the Democrats here, and I just want everybody to understand, when the tables have been turned, the Republicans have done the same thing. So they're all really good. They're really good parliamentarians at what they are. But the institutions themselves, they're not fully majoritarian. They have minoritarian elements, and that is why you can't just pass something big like a budget very often unless you have buy-in from at least a handful of the other side who will say, okay, we'll sign off on this, and that's how they'll get it. So anyway, I hope that that somewhat addressed those questions, and then I guess we could go on ahead and move on, right?
Matt, thank you for that. I noticed they also, Douglas had asked about the tariffs and President Trump's ability to levy them. We're actually going to talk about that in a later section because the court has actually agreed to hear a case that is in fact challenging the Trump administration's unilateral usage of tariffs. Historically and constitutionally, when you look at tariffs, that is a function of Congress, but Congress has delegated on several occasions an enormous amount of discretionary authority to presidents to unilaterally invoke tariffs on one, two, or all nation states. It's almost always predicated, however, on emergencies. And the principal argument that the court will be hearing this session is whether or not these are actual emergencies. And many would argue that no, these are not actual emergencies. These tariffs are being unilaterally issued by the Trump administration simply because President Trump is a huge, huge advocate of tariffs. But we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Great. Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, one of the things that's also, I think, postponing the shutdown is the fact that, and this is not just the healthcare issue, which I think is an important issue, but I think there's an underlying sort of issue with the Democrats where, they believe, not without good reason, based on, the past, I guess 10 months or so, that if they are, say they do reopen the government, say they do allow for the continuing resolution to pass or whatever, there is a concern that the president will just sort of pick and choose what he funds and what he doesn't fund, right? And that goes back to some of the stuff that you were talking about, particularly Dr. Cavalier was talking about in terms of the Nixon administration and impoundment and that sort of thing, where President Nixon tried this before, essentially, where he decided that he was going to unilaterally pick and choose which programs Congress had authorized and appropriated for, and withhold funding from programs he didn't like or he didn't think were good uses of taxpayer money or whatever, right? And that's what, of course, led to the Budget Impoundment and Control Act. I can't remember. Then Dr. Catway had the exact title. And so, and there's, I think a genuine concern among Democrats and even some Republicans that the president is essentially going to ignore that law. So from the Democrats' perspective, why would they reopen the government just to do things that only going to be the things that the president wants to do, right? And under the separation of powers and checks and balances, the idea is that the president doesn't have unilateral authority over the budget, and that is, I think, the underlying concern here. In addition to that sort of more public issue of the Obamacare's subsidies. So I think we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. We do have a couple of good questions in the chat, but we may get to those a little bit later. And that is, and this may actually dovetail a little bit with some of the questions in the chat as well. So this past weekend, we saw several million people across the country, not just several people, but several million people across the country attend protests against the Trump administration. The so-called No Kings protests. I think this is the second round of those protests. Why were those people protesting, and what, if any, is the likely impact of these protests? I'll let Dr. Cavalier lead off, since Dr. Hall led off the first question.
Sure, I'll give it a shot here. So this issue, actually, I can connect this directly to one of the questions in the chat. So I'll do this in the following way. So Tazavian asked, could you explain the idea of a unitary executive? This term has recently emerged regarding President Trump firing employees from agencies who are understood to be free from the executive. That, by the way, is actually going to also tip into some of the court stuff. That's one of the court cases that's up there. So uh, basically, the No Kings protests, and this was whatever it is, the second or the third round of the No Kings protests. Its basis for it is that the protesters claim that President Trump has um, exceeded his constitutional authority, that he has moved. Comparative scholars talk about that political regimes can either be um, rule of law regimes, which are sort of standard order. So the Constitution would be a rule of law regime, or they can be rule by law. And rule by law means that there's an arbitrary power that commands and controls. And so the No Kings protest is a reaction by people that lean, are from the middle to the left politically against President Trump, although there are some on the right that have joined in this as well. That the claim is that he is behaving more as a king. And what they're really tapping into is, if you read the Declaration of Independence, what you'll find is that everybody talks about the first half of the Declaration, the created equal and life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, all that stuff. But if you read the second half of the Declaration, the Declaration of Independence is a series of indictments. These are legal charges, and they're done because what the Declaration was it was emphasizing the Enlightenment idea of the Lockean right of rebellion. That when a government no longer governed within the consent of the governed, when a government no longer governed in the consent of the governed, then it was the not just the right but the duty of the people to overthrow the government. Anyway, it was a justification for the Revolutionary War and for particularly for the separation of the British Empire that created the United States of America. So that second half of the Declaration, there are a series of paragraph-long indictments that begin with the phrase "he has," and the he they're talking about is King George III, the Emperor of the British Empire at that time. What the protests, both this round of protests and previous rounds of protests that have had the theme of the No Kings, is that they're essentially claiming that President Trump is so expanding executive authority that he's moving in the direction of becoming an arbitrary power, like we claimed, our forefathers claimed, King George III had been doing relative to the American colonies. And so they're tapping that concept in of the old notion of being a patriot, which is meant that was a dissent mentality, that there's a strong government out there that's arbitrary, that's not governing the interests of its citizens, but instead governing the interest of itself. And so they're equating President Trump with an authoritarian figure, and attaching in that what makes America special, if anything does make America special, is that we are a limited government state. And how do we keep a limited government? Well, through the good order of the Constitution, that's separation of powers. That Trump is fundamentally, that's claimed that President Trump is fundamentally violating the notion of the separation of powers. Now, this concept of unitary executive is a philosophical, legal, and political theoretic notion that really came out of conservative thinkers who felt that Chris had talked about Richard Nixon, who felt that in the wake of Johnson with Vietnam and Nixon with Watergate, that the country had went too far away from presidential power, and they had spent too much power. So one of those things we talked about in the Budget and Empowerment Control Act of 1974, along with the War Powers Resolution and the Subcommittee Bill of Rights and a few other things, were all built around the resurgence of the Congress. Well, why was the Congress resurging? Well, there was a claim that Johnson and Nixon, and they're like Schlesinger called it the imperial presidency, that had been. So the unitary executive theory is the claim that those who agitated against the imperial presidency and deconstructed it through things like the Budget Control Act, that those people had went too far, and that the presidency had become enfeebled as an institution, and that it was not able to lead the country and lead the world, particularly the free world. And so a body of thought that began to emerge in the 80s and the 90s, and it really fed the George W. Bush administration of the first decade of the 2000s, especially in the time of war, and the claim that one of the great political architects of the unitary executive theory, who has now become, by the way, one of the great opponents of it, a bit irony there, is Richard Bruce Cheney, who was vice president of the United States. Vice President Cheney claimed that in the wake of 9/11 and in wartime conditions, especially, and to a lesser extent in all conditions, the presidency needed to be stronger. And so this has begged the question: are the No Kings folks would say that we are on the verge of once again entering into an imperial presidency because the unitary executive is out of control. So where the presidency is dominating the judiciary, the legislature. The specific question went about, who can the president, so things like this, so this is what the court case is about. Can the president control the people that sit in independent regulatory agencies? Now, the President Trump's claim, of course, is that, well, of course I can do this because they're in the executive branch and I'm the chief executive. And you know what? I got an agenda. They don't want to follow my agenda. I'm going to get them out of here. But the Congress ultimately sets up those agencies. And when the Congress set those agencies up, they set those agencies up to be independent, to have a degree of discretion away from arbitrary partisan power of the president. This, by the way, is also attached in with civil service, which is impacted with some of these firings as well. The reason why the Civil Service Reform Act, the Civil Service was put in, the Pendleton Act of 1883, forward, was it was actually put to place a limit on politicians, and by this, at the federal level, they're really talking here about the president and ability to stack the bureaucracy with his co-partisans, and to turn the bureaucracy into an instrument of his will. Now, if you're going to go to a No More Kings rally, they'll say, "Well, see, there it is. That's a pile of evidence that we've got a emperor wannabe out there, and we got to do something against him." And of course, the people that oppose the No More Kings would say that, well, no, they're a little bit. That's a little bit too far over. Trump still operates within the rule. We're not a rule by law. We're a rule of law. Trump's really not a king, and he's operating within limits. He can do what he wants to do within the executive branch. So notice how, whichever side you're on, you can find a body of evidence that supports your contention, and therein lies the problem of politics. Very often we have two right answers. We also, by the way, have two wrong answers at the same time. So anyway, with all of that, I hope that was of some help. I'm going to turn things over to John.
That was a fantastic response. I really couldn't add much to that. Again, I think the No Kings rally is fundamentally, as you said, Dr. Caverly, it is a response to perceived authoritarian measures by the Trump administration. And the authoritarian measures are, by definition, somewhat authoritarian when the president uses the Justice Department, for example, to seek out and punish his enemies. This is usually something that you would say the president is accused of using the Justice Department to seek out and punish his enemies. But President Trump actually just says it out loud. He says on many occasions, I'm using the Justice Department to seek out and punish my enemies. That is authoritarian in nature. Using the National Guard, going into Los Angeles, going into Portland, going into Chicago to reduce crime is seen by many to be simply a facade for trying to provoke some kind of unrest when those military personnel are there that could then possibly kick in something like the Insurrection Act and use actual military forces. I think a lot of people perceive that the Trump administration is abusing Article 2 powers because there's clear evidence that it's definitely being pushed. The thresholds are being pushed in ways that we haven't really seen since the Lincoln administration. When you see peaceful protests in Portland, when you see people this is going to be, I'm predicting this is going to be a very famous image. When you see an inflatable frog that is dancing in front of, I'm hoping everyone has seen this or else I just made no sense. When you see peaceful protests being responded to with military force, it starts to appear as if the National Guard isn't really needed in Portland to put down the violent rebellion. It's actually there to possibly create a situation that might become violent. I think a lot of the No Kings protest is responding directly to Trump administration policies, to say nothing of immigration reform and using ICE to theoretically, constitutionally violate the liberties of individuals in this country without due process. This is not the first one, by the way. This is huge. So I think over 7 million people attended. There was one also in the summer that had millions of people attending. And thankfully, so far, the No Kings protests have, in fact, been peaceful. But I would argue that overall, this is a response by Americans who are recognizing authoritarian tendencies in the president. And in some cases, it's authoritarian tendencies because he's literally saying things that are authoritarian. But again, I think we've asked the possible question of, does it matter? That's a question that none of us can answer. But anytime millions of Americans go out on several different occasions and peacefully protest the current administration, I think that always matters. You're always going to have the Democrats and the Republicans falling into their camps, but that ever important 1/3 of Americans that fall into that independent camp, that's the ones that it's going to matter for. How the independents view this, I think, will determine whether the No Kings protests are successful or not.
Okay, great. So before we move on to the next scripted question, we do have one question from, I assume it's Jared Torres. Could be Torres Jared, I'm not sure which, in the chat. And they say, it feels though both major parties have become more focused on defeating one another than on solving the real problems that affect everyday Americans. In addition, it feels like Congress has become more reactive rather than proactive. Could you possibly elaborate more on this matter?
Well, I'll take I'll take by the way, it is Jared. Jared's one of my students, and actually, Jared spoke with me about this question earlier on. But I'm glad that he asked it for everybody. So one of the things that has happened in the last 120 years has been that there has been a retreat, generally speaking, of the Congress as the national dominant force in public policy making. And there has been a surgence of the presidency. And so the Congress is proactive as a representative assembly. It's just not that proactive as a national lawmaker. And so if you look back at most of the big laws that have been created in the last 100+ years, what got them really generated through was presidential leadership, for good, bad, or indifferent reasons. Now, you can point, there are some significant pieces of legislation that have been done in opposition to presidentialism. If you one we already talked about here, that's the Budget Control Act. There's a few others, Taft-Hartley and some of the others, But overall, the president has been the dominant force in American national politics for good, bad, or indifferent reasons. But and so this, my students are tired of hear me talking about this, but I'll talk about it anyway. If you read the Constitution, that is not really the way it's written. Half the Constitution is Article 1. I said the original document. The vast majority of expressed or enumerated powers lie with the Congress. Legislative supremacy was the dominant force in national politics in the 18th and 19th centuries. The part of what has happened is that the Congress, if you will, stepped away from the breach, and the presidency stepped in, and there's a question whether or not the presidency is going to step out or whatnot. But nonetheless, so what is this? If you surge the presidency to a certain point, what do you wind up with? Well, you can argue you wind up with an imperial presidency, you wind up with a unitary executive, you wind up with the kind of politics that we see playing out in front of our eyes right now, whether you agree or disagree with those. But I do want to throw there is the notion, though, that the Congress, I don't want to say is completely reactive. They do a really good job of representing their constituents, which is they've always done a good job, but they've especially do a good job it is. And you can make an argument that actually, going back to the previous topic, that is what the Democratic representatives are doing regarding their constituents, and to some extent, that's what the Republican representative senators are doing regarding their constituents in the whole government shutdown. But these things that are going on today about the question of arbitrary power, again, these things have appeared before, but we'll see where all this goes. But a lot of this does beg around who controls what. And you have to ask, well, why do we even have this? Well, we have this because we actually don't have a dictator, at least so far. And our system cuts up power. And so that produces invitations to struggle. We have dilemmas of who has the power. Professor Hall was talking there. I mean, who really does control the National Guard in terms of its police powers, especially when there is no war? The Insurrection Act has not actually been invoked. And the local authorities have claimed that they don't need the Guard. Normally, a traditional thing within the Guard is that you wait for a governor to say, well, we need some help. and I'm going to call up the Guard. And if things get really bad, then the president steps in. But what we have going on right now is the president steps in right in the beginning. But that's we haven't seen that that I can think of. We haven't seen that in recent times. So it's an interesting thing where we're at right now. We live in interesting times.
I agree with that, Dr. Caverly, and great point that you had made. It's important to note that, as you mentioned, we have a government that is limited. The Constitution's genius is that it created a federal government of enumerated powers, specific powers, with just enough elastic language and things like the necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause to allow the federal government to do things that Madison could never have imagined if need be. However, it's important to note that while borrowing from Montesquieu, while creating one of the single greatest gifts in the history of governments created to stop tyranny, and that is the separation of powers doctrine. It is the core of the genius of our federal system that is designed to prevent the rise of tyranny. Our federal government was not designed for efficiency. You could argue it wasn't really designed for representation. It was designed for one thing: to prevent the rise of tyranny in future generations. And it's done a great job. But the separation of powers doctrine has a cancer built within it, and that is partisanship. The separation of powers doctrine does not exist anymore, and it does not protect us anymore. if the members of the Senate and the House no longer view themselves as members of co-equal chambers, but as Republicans, as Democrats. When the president doesn't view the House and the Senate as the legislature, when he views them as Democrats and Republicans, all of the safeties of the separation of powers doctrine are gone. And I think that's a lot of the fear that people are experiencing now with such an overwhelmingly active president like President Trump. He is, if anything else, not shy, and he is aggressively, especially in the second and last term, he is aggressively pursuing his policy desires, and the Republican Party is in lockstep in the House and the Senate. So I think that's another reason why there's a degree of fear that you might not experience in other administrations, because that Republican Party has so much power and they are supporting President Trump with such consistency. But everything else that Dr. Caverly said, I really can't add much to it. That was a great response.
Great, thanks. Let's see. So I guess we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. By the way, I'm not sure if this is just me or maybe it's just everybody, but Dr. Hall's video seems to be frozen. So, but that might just be at my end. So.
No, his video is frozen.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
We can hear you fine, but
so.
we just have a frozen picture.
Well, I hope it's frozen on an attractive picture of my face.
Well, let's see. Anyway, it wasn't too bad. So I guess we'll go ahead and move on to our next question, which is that, as alluded to in a couple of our previous responses, the Supreme Court is now considering a number of cases this fall as part of its October term. What are some of the most important cases the Supreme Court is hearing this fall? And I know this is in Dr. Hall's wheelhouse, so I'll let him lead off. And he is now no longer frozen.
Oh, excellent. Fantastic. Well, we can start off with something that we've already talked about, and that is the tariffs. Tariffs, again, being a power that Congress over the last century and a half has delegated an enormous amount of unilateral power to the president, almost all of it, but without going into all of the legislation that has incrementally given the president more and more power to unilaterally dictate tariffs. Almost all of it is predicated on emergencies. If we are in an emergency and we need fast unilateral action, we have a phenomenal branch to do that. That's what the executive branch excels at. Congress is great at debating and talking and getting in committees, and that's valuable. But when we need fast action, that's what the executive branch is for. So Congress has delegated an enormous amount of power to the president, but almost all of it, again, predicated on emergencies. And the court has accepted a case that they will hear this session to determine whether or not the Trump administration has overstepped that delegated authority. If I were making a prediction, just generically speaking, we're not in a global emergency. We were not in a global economic catastrophe. We are not currently taking part in a global war. This is a nonpartisan, very neutral prediction in that we're not experiencing any grand global emergency. So there's a chance that the court would actually argue that the president has exceeded those delegated powers. Not to mention the fact that the lower federal court has already said that the Trump administration overreached in its unilateral imposition of tariffs across many, many different nation states, sometimes excessive tariffs. So that's one thing to look forward to. We also have, if anyone follows the liberties of the LGBT community, we have some extraordinarily important cases coming up based on transgender rights. The court will hear several cases that all revolve around the contemporary transgender issues that I'm sure we're all familiar with. First and foremost, if I'm a transgender man, I'm a transgender man, meaning if I'm a transgender woman, meaning I was born with XY chromosomes, but I identify as a woman, should I be able to take part in women's sports? One case, the Little versus Hexcox, this is out of Boise State University, and this is when the court is going to give itself the opportunity to possibly give a definitive answer on whether transgender women will be allowed to take part in transgender sports. This is a fascinating case, not just because it involves extraordinarily important civil liberties for many Americans, but it's an area that you start to see some distinctions in terms of Democratic/Republican support. This is an area that America, in terms of our political culture, we have not yet come to a universal understanding of. So the court's opinion on whether or not transgender women will be allowed to take part in transgender sports as women will be an interesting case in terms of civil liberties and public opinion. We also have the court accepting a case that will be exploring other transgender rights, particularly as it relates to conversion therapy. This is a case out of Colorado. This isn't just actually transgender. This has to do with sexual identification and orientation. And the court has in the past upheld states that have banned transition therapy, basically meaning that there are therapists or groups who will take people whose sexual orientation is homosexual, or they may be lesbian, gay, and try to transition them into something that they consider more mainstream or heterosexual. This has been something that states have banned. This is about to come back into the national discussion because the court is accepting a case on that. Forgive me, someone just walked in the room and threw me off there. So there are several issues related to the transgender community. We're also going to see a case involving gun laws out of Hawaii, whether or not individuals can be prohibited from carrying weapons on private property if that has been prohibited on that private property. This is another opportunity for the court to further expand Second Amendment case law that has been relatively concrete since the late Justice Scalia's opinion in D.C. versus Heller that identified gun rights as an individual right, not connected to military service, and a right that can be regulated by government. We're also going to get a case on campaign finance reform. This is being pushed by Republican backers who want to challenge on the grounds of free speech federal campaign finance laws. And again, we don't have very many robust federal campaign finance laws, but there are those who are trying to challenge the prohibition on coordination with political parties and what we historically have called soft money that has been found to be unlimited when the Federal Election Commission case by the court in Citizens United was issued. But we're going to see an attempt at possibly actually opening up even more money or access to money in American politics. There are many other cases of extraordinary interest coming up. If I don't slow down right there and open the floor up to everyone else, I'm not going to stop. So again, we have some transgender cases, we have tariff cases, we have one incredibly important gun rights case among many others. I'll open it up to Matt and Chris if y'all had any particular cases that y'all wanted to discuss. And we can make predictions about where they go if anyone has any questions on those.
Well, let's see. I think once again, I think that John, you have a kind of a full coverage there. I got one or two here that I think we could add to the mix. One of them, a very political one, the Bost versus Illinois State Board of Elections. And what this case is about is what votes get counted. And so the way the law is right now, or the way the law is understood, is that if you are, say, somebody who lives abroad, or you did an absentee ballot for whatever reason, as long as a legit reason to have absentee ballot, as long as it's postmarked by election day, it will get counted. Even if it comes in 2, 3, 4, 5 days after the election is over. There has been a challenge that has been made to that status quo, and the claim is by the bringers of the suit is that by Bost is that this hurts the good order of elections, and it adds uncertainty and so on and so forth. And so that what you should do is if the votes, you should only count the votes that have gotten there either on or before on election day, and it doesn't matter. Their claim is that the postmark is that's too bad. You should have gotten it in the mail earlier. But it's not surprising that this particular challenge is an interesting challenge because it's been brought forth by folks who kind of know the way that most of the absentee ballots go, especially the ones from abroad. They know which side that they tend to vote for. And so you can block off a group. And it might not matter much, but you have to understand it because of the electorate is so tight. And that's one of the great differences of our modern electoral system versus, say, in the 1890s or the 1900s or the first decade of the 20th century. Back then at the national level, about 3 out of every 4 voters was Republican. And in the 40s and 50s, about 2 out of every 3 voters were Democratic. But since the 70s, we've been kind of in a 50-50 electorate. And so whoever either wins turnout, either by being high turnout or low turnout, or among whichever groups tends to win. In the last presidential election, while on the electoral college front, we have to give credit where credit is due. President Trump did very well. And he did win the national popular vote. But he won the national popular vote by 1.5%. And that's like the population of Chicago. I mean, it's not much. So if you can, if you will, game the system on how many votes are coming in and when they don't and whatnot, that then you can help determine who's going to win. So that's one thing that's out there. There's actually a question that was on Boast. Boast versus Illinois board. Does Boast have standing to sue? Because Boast argues that the mail-in ballots may cause a politician. Isn't the risk of a loss of an election inherent to the role of a politician? Well, you could make that argument. I will say this. I don't think they would decide that question on whether or not Boast has standing. But I could be wrong on that. John might want to comment on that, but I believe he'll be awarded standing. But I do understand that the framework from which the question is arising from, well, elections are by their nature competitive. If you don't want to lose a game, don't play the sport.
He would definitely have standing. I mean, he's a citizen who is questioning the constitutionality of the state. This I have special feelings about this case. No one doubts the Constitution gives the power to regulate elections to state governments. The time, place, and manner clause gives state governments this power. And what they're challenging is whether or not you can count mail-in ballots that are received by the day of the election. They're not saying, can we take mail-in ballots after the election? They're saying by the day of the election. So, I mean, I cannot imagine that this, under normal circumstances, I can't imagine that the court would say that is not well within the power of the state of Illinois to set that as the end mark of mail-in ballots. This is definitely a partisan issue. And again, I don't blame either side. It's just in recent years, the majority of mail-in ballots have been cast by Democratic voters. So if you're a Republican candidate, clearly you would want to limit the ability of mail-in ballots to come in up until the day of the election. Again, if I were a Republican running in Illinois, I would be very much in favor of this litigation. I would be right there with them screaming, I don't want these to count, because they're probably going to be votes for the other side. This is one of the main reasons why you see on the day of the election so much of a massive surge of Democratic votes once those mail-in ballots start to get counted. considering the fact that most states don't allow you to count those mail-in ballots until the day of the election. But yeah, this is an understandable case, but I would be shocked if the court says that the state of Illinois doesn't have the power to do that. If they were to say we will accept mail-in ballots the day after the election, now that would be a different story. But in this case, that's pretty cut and dry.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think John's prediction is probably up on that. Let's see here. What else we got here?
It's a good question on the Calais.
Oh, okay. Here's a good one.
Yeah,
Here's a good one. This comes out of the chat as well.
Yeah.
And it's about the Louisiana versus Calais. About the VRA.
Yeah, that's a fascinating case in that what is left of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 does allow for what could be considered racially biased gerrymandering. Now, not to get into a Voting Rights Act of 1965 lecture here, but it was instrumental in that it might be one of the single most successful pieces of legislation in American history in terms of achieving what it set out to achieve. A century of post-15th Amendment racial discrimination in terms of voter registration and voter turnout, not just in the American South, but particularly in the American South, was eradicated in one piece of legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically said that states, a collection of states, among them were Georgia, that had a history of racially biased voter registration laws would have to start to submit to a federal clearinghouse in D.C. any changes to voter registration laws. This was controversial because, as we all know, and we've already said, states are in charge of voting regulations within their territory. But when you have states that have a century of history of racially biased voter registration laws, the court said you're going to have to start checking in with mom and dad in D.C. basically to make sure that your voter registration laws aren't racially biased. This resulted in an explosion in African-American voting from 1965 onward. It was so successful that in the Shelby County versus Holder opinion in the early 21st century, the court was asked by the state of Alabama, can we please stop checking in with the federal government when we change our voter registration laws? Because this is the 21st century Alabama. We're not racist Alabama anymore. And the Voting Rights Act was so successful, the court agreed and got rid of that requirement for that clearinghouse. I say that only to say this. The most successful, most important part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been gone for well over a decade. But one of the component parts that still remains is the possibility of recognizing that there are congressional districts within a state that have extraordinarily large African-American populations that are being split by multiple congressional districts. In other words, there may be, without necessarily the need to prove it empirically, because it's kind of impossible to do so, the ability to allow for racially biased gerrymandering in order to give minority groups within a state more congressional representation than they had been receiving in the past. And what is before the court in the Calais case in Louisiana is nothing short of the possible death of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 once and for all, depending on the direction in which they go. So that will be a fascinating opinion, and I wouldn't give you any odds on the direction the court is going to take that. But the survival of what's left of the Voting Rights Act of 65 is definitely at stake there. It'll be beyond interesting to see what the court says. If y'all have any opinions or are braver than I am and want to jump out there and say what you think the court will say, then have at it.
Well, I don't have any speculation on it, but I do think Douglas is he's the one Douglas Easter has asked a question about it. But what the result of Douglas, what you're talking about here, will it modulate some districts or expand Republican majorities? Would have an impact on the equal protection suspect classifications? The answer to those is yes, depending upon which way they go. So it could, if they decide one way, it could expand Republican majorities if they stamp it. It could work against equal protection systematically. That's where John brought up the Civil Rights Act itself, not just the VRA, but the CRA. So if they go the other way, then you might have another thing. And the reason why I say that, the reason why you have to guess on a little bit speculative on this is because the courts um, the courts have not been consistently one way or the other. There has been a leaning to the right, which you would expect given the composition of the court, but they have done a number of things regarding social issues, including voting, which would make it you might not actually um, think they'll go the way sometimes that they will. John Roberts is an interesting fellow that way. Somebody's going to, maybe John Hall one day will write a fantastic work on John Roberts. He's a fascinating Chief Justice. Not all Chief Justices are created equal. I don't say that for him or against him. I just say he's led a very different court from what people like myself predicted that he would back in the day. So I freely admit I was wrong. But anyway, oh, okay, we got another one on here, and then but this actually comes in with one of our cases is regarding Case versus Montana about the Fourth Amendment, which is John's area of particular specialization. But in a similar type thing, Sarah asks, given the Supreme Court's recent stay in Nome versus Vasquez Perdomo, which temporarily allows ICE to conduct stops based on race, language, or location. How does this align with the existing constitutional precedent under the Fourth and 14th Amendments that restricts law enforcement from using race as the primary basis for stops? And if the court upholds ICE's authority to use these factors, what are the most concerning possible outcomes? Well, we have a subject matter expert on this thing, and so I'm going to let him answer that. But I would just say this that there has long been a pattern um, of race-based profiling in law enforcement, criminal justice generally, and so much so that it's given to the names of DWB, driving while black or brown. So what what this case? How will this affect? I mean, clearly the Secretary of Homeland Security wants these things to advance, whereas the opposition, of course, would not. But I think since we have John here, maybe he can enlighten us on this a little bit. This is kind of his bread and butter.
That's a fantastic question, and it's a mixed answer. It's a mixed bag. When it comes to protecting the border, the court has long since found that the federal government has not extra constitutional powers, but powers that don't necessarily protect the Fourth Amendment in the same way they would if you were in a metropolitan area deep within Nebraska. So if you are dealing with ICE and they're detaining people, questioning people based on demographic variables that would under any other circumstances be obviously unconstitutional, there is a precedent there that the court would allow for that in certain circumstances if it is in the process of protecting national security and protecting the integrity of our borders. However, when state governments in the past, like Arizona, have come out with legislation that specifically states that you are able to pull people over based on the color of their skin, with the assumption that that person could possibly be in this country in an undocumented manner, the federal court then said no and overturned that. So an outright allowance for detaining people based on demographic variables like race or language is something where the court does not have a long history of supporting. However, you mentioned location. When it comes to location, the court has a long history of allowing for extra constitutional powers on the part of the federal government, not so much the state governments, but definitely the federal government. So if you are within 100 miles of a U.S. border, you are in an area that the federal court has allowed in the past, depending on the circumstances, for what would otherwise be considered violations of the Fourth Amendment that they don't consider then. The disturbing part is that most Americans live within 100 miles of an American border. Most of us live near the coast. So that sounds like a neutral in the middle of the road answer because that's the only answer that I can give. It really does depend. If you're looking at demographic variables like race and what language you're speaking, the court has a long history of not allowing that in a formal manner. If you're looking at location, the court does have a history of allowing for some Fourth Amendment violations there. This is going to be an extraordinarily interesting case, and I've got some theories on which direction the court would eventually go here, particularly this court. As Dr. Cavely said, this is one of the more conservative courts in American history, but it's important to note that of the three branches of government, the court is traditionally the most conservative branch, not from a partisan perspective like liberal, like a Democrat Republican, but in terms of the classical ideological definitions of liberal and conservative. Do you have a great deal of comfort changing the status quo? Liberal. Do you not want to change the status quo? Conservative. The court is the more conservative branch. If for no other reason that they don't have any enforcement mechanisms. They have to rely on the elected branches to carry out their opinions. But fascinating case, and I don't mean to use fascinating flippantly because this case deals with a very serious subject matter and the possible violation of constitutionally protected liberties for Americans and non-Americans. But from a constitutional perspective, it'll be interesting to see which direction the court goes. There's precedent for both directions. That was a middle of the road answer.
Great, thanks. So I don't think we've got any additional questions from the chat. So I think we'll, let's see, we got about 12 minutes left. So I guess we'll go ahead and turn to our first state politics question, see if we get through at least one of them. So early voting is now underway for those November 4th elections in Georgia. The main statewide contests are two elections that have been previously postponed due to a lawsuit that are going to fill 2 seats on the Georgia Public Service Commission. So what does the Public Service Commission do, and why is this an important election, and why should people be interested in it? I think we'll let Dr. Caverly lead off since it's his turn.
Sure. So Georgia and the states generally, what they do, they have what's called plural executive. They cut up the executive power internally and divide it out among different elements. And so they actually have things like independent commissions that are elected that are not under the direct authority of the governor. And one of these is the Public Service Commission. And the Public Service Commission, what they're responsible for is that they regulate utilities, telecommunications, electricity, natural gas. And while they're statewide elections, their area of responsibility is divided up in geographic districts. And so of the 5 commission seats, 2 of them are up for election on November the 4th. And if there is a runoff, so this is something else that where the states are a bit different than the national level. The states often use what's known as a majoritarian electoral system rather than a plurality electoral system. Now, just very quickly here for the people who want to take comparative politics class, a plurality electoral system is first past the post. So whoever gets the most gets it all. Whereas a majoritarian system means that you require an absolute majority. So as an example, at the national level, to win the U.S. presidency, you must have an absolute majority of the electoral college. That's you got to have 50% plus 1. Right now, that's 270 electoral votes. But going back here to Georgia, they often have, like a lot of the states do, and like a lot of localities, they have the majoritarian system. What that means is this: if nobody gets a majority in the general election, in this case, sometimes they use them in primaries as well. In fact, they do use them in primaries here in Georgia. Then they have a runoff election, usually a month later. Again, following course here. And among the top two winners, or in some states it might be the top three winners or whatever. But anyway, the first election very often winnows people down with the plurality, and then in the next month they have the runoff. Now I don't know if there's going to be a runoff. That's for starters. But if there is a runoff, it'll be in December, on December 2nd. That's just little for the state and local people out there. But nonetheless, we have these two districts, and the one district is let me get these right here. The District 2 is kind of in the greater Athens to Savannah, eastern Georgia. The other district is District 3, and that's basically Atlanta, the Atlanta metropolitan area. Now, these are statewide elections, and they are partisan. So you have, in both cases, the incumbents are running for re-election. Both of the incumbents are Republicans. Republicans very often win statewide. Now, that's not a guarantee, but Georgia does lean in the Republican direction, particularly when you think about it as a statewide entity. And so I looked up there's a wonderful, people that are interested, there's a wonderful website. It's called Ballotpedia, which could give you a lot of information on various elections, including this one. Well, one thing that stood out to me about these, because remember, this is public, this is for utility governance, that the attentions in both districts along the issues were about the same. And I found that a bit fascinating. Both of them talked about environmental issues impacting public utilities. And both of them talked about promoting greater equity of access to utilities from, traditionally marginalized groups and whatnot. They also, both of them spoke about, and I was very surprised to see this about the Atlanta district. They talked about rural areas, because that's a huge thing with utilities. I can tell you, somebody who lives out in a rural area, and I'm down in Florida, but I live out in the country, and I'm telling you, we don't have the political power that they do in the big towns and the big cities. And so that it also speaks to something, and I'll turn over to John, but it speaks to some of the people that are interested in state and local politics, that a lot of times what we look at the national level as these very intensive left-right divide stuff, when you hit down to states and localities, there tends to be a little bit more bipartisanship, and there tends to be a unanimity around issues. They may disagree on the big stuff. One of them is for abortion and one of them's against abortion. But abortion doesn't really matter that much about public utilities. So there's a fascinating thing on these. The other thing I would say about these is also a manifestation of something that is somewhat unique here in Georgia. The driving force in these is the county commission, and the reason why is because here in Georgia we have home rule counties. We have chartered, meaning constituted counties. So counties are very powerful here in Georgia. It's one of the reasons why there's 159 of them. But we see a manifestation of this within statewide wide politics. So it's an interesting little phenomenon that goes on. We'll address that. We would address that as the next topic. We're not going to get to it, I don't think. But the about the taxes. But it's a fascinating here that even here we have statewide system, but it's cut up into regions, and those regions manifest the county power. And so anyway, a little state and local politics there for everybody. But I'll turn it over to John.
Matt, I really can't add anything to that. That was a phenomenal description of the issue. It is interesting that there are 2 seats up now because of legal challenges to the way that this election is taking place. But I really can't add much more to that that would be of any value. Great job. If you wanted to talk about eSplosh for 2 seconds.
Well, you know what? You know what? I will. Why not? Why not? We got just a little bit of time here. So, so in the Georgia state government has allows, and the local levels, a discretionary power. It's called a SPLOST, Special Purpose Local Option Sales Tax. So there's a state sales tax. And then in the localities, they can add on to that sales tax for special projects in their locality. And again, it's run through the county commission. Now, very often they're going to bring in the city commissions, and the ones with the reason why it's called eSplot is E means education. So this is the SPLOT for education. But education, if you ever, those out there have an interest in studying state and local politics, what they're going to find is that education is a special category unto itself. Education has its own government, the school boards. They're the canonical special district government, but it's the big one. School boards are very powerful, and they're usually one of the dominant governments in the area, and they have a lot of influence on what happens in the creation of these, and then in the execution of them and what they do with the money. But it's specified. These are taxes for a specific purpose, as opposed to the general way of doing taxes, when we all pay our taxes generally, even all the way up to income tax at the national level. You know, they build aircraft carriers with them. They fund the police forces. They do all kinds of stuff. But in the case of these SPLOS, particularly the eSplot, it has to be education in this case, and it has to be executed locally for specific projects. So people actually, when they vote on these things, they actually know what they're voting for. They're not just giving the government money. And so it's an interesting phenomenon. I'm not sure it would ever really work outside of the local communities, but it's an interesting phenomenon. But it goes back to in a land of states' rights, it's become local rights. How your taxes are spent is a local right. It is a right, and it's practiced here locally. But anyway, I'll shut up on that. But it's a fascinating subject, and it's very important for all of your lives, especially if you're going to stay here in Georgia.
Great summary there. And I want to point out quickly that there is one in Houston County. If you, like me, live in Houston County and in Bibb County. So if you're interested and want to take part in that 1-cent tax to improve education capital projects, it's mostly going to be spent on infrastructure projects for public education in Houston and Bibb counties. Make sure to get out and vote. I'll turn it back to Chris.
Okay, great. And we are just about right at our wrap-up time. So great job squeezing that one in. So I'd like to thank both Dr. Cavalier and Dr. Hall for their insights, and also I'd like to thank our audience, and particularly those that asked questions in the chat, for your very probing and insightful questions as well. So before we adjourn, just a couple of brief things. We do have an upcoming discussion event on Wednesday, on November 12th, which will be focused on global issues. And so we invite you to join us for that. And there'll be some invitations and stuff going out for that probably in the next week or so. So keep an eye out for that as well. The announcement's already on the School of Arts and Letters events page, but we will also have a more formal announcement going out in various forums as well. And I expect some of your faculty will also be sharing those in their classes as well. For those of you that are looking for a recording of this event, or those if you want to share this with somebody else, we'll have that posted probably the next 12 to 24 hours on our YouTube page, just youtube.com/@MGA Pulse Sci. So it's at MGA Pulse Sci on YouTube. So we'll get that posted there. I guess that's it. So I'd like to thank again everybody for coming out, and hope to see you at our next event. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact any of us by email. Otherwise, we'll hopefully
Uh,
see you down the
Chris,
road.
Chris,
Oh
can I
yes,
interject
yeah,
just for 1 second? Just for 1 second. I know we're a minute
sure,
over.
yes.
I noticed there was some interest in the court cases. I'm going to put in the chat what we have here on the Cochrane campus is we have a pre-law club. I'm the faculty advisor for it. And so I'm gonna put in the chat the name and the email address of the head of the club, the president of the club. Her name is Tori Howard. So if anybody is interested, would like to become involved in the pre-law club, either because you have an interest in legal issues or because you have an interest in working in law as a paralegal, all the way up to an attorney yourself. So anyway, I'm just going to put this in here for people's information.
Great, thank you, man. Thank you, Dr. Cavalley. Yeah, I think that's a great initiative down there on the Cochrane campus, and hopefully we get something like that kicked off here on the Macon campus as well. So thank you for that, Dr. Cavalley. Any last thoughts from Dr. Hall?
Now, thank you all for coming out. And again, thank you all to the students who have been here. And I think they are now leaving. So thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, great. Thanks, and we'll see you soon.